Meep.
So, after a nearly 2-year wait, Scott Pilgrim Takes Off has finally dropped on Netflix, and it was weird. But I don't mean that as a bad thing. Now, I'll admit, I had a ton of conflicting thoughts and expectations going into this series. When it was first announced, I wasn't really stoked on the idea of bringing everyone back just to tell what appeared to be the exact same story, except this time it's animated. I just personally felt like using those same resources for a sequel would have made more sense. Yet, at the same time, I saw a ton of potential in the concept of telling the same old Scott Pilgrim story in a new medium. A miniseries especially would give that story the breathing room it lacked in its film adaptation, and with all that extra space, maybe it'd end up being a more nuanced and emotionally impactful on-screen experience than it ever was before. So with all that in the back of my mind, I sat down and binged the entire series twice, and I have to say that it both defied and exactly met all of my conflicting expectations going in. This is a particularly difficult show to review without spoiling it, because the spoiler-free version is simply that in just about every technical aspect, this show lives up to the standards that the Scott Pilgrim franchise has set for itself. It's visually dazzling a lot of the time, featuring a few stylish fight sequences and stunning frames that leapt from the screen, with some solid performances and a great soundtrack to match. In prototypical Scott Pilgrim fashion, it's filled to the brim with problematic but ultimately lovable 20-something-year-old characters who work together to confront their pasts and learn to become better people. There are some tough pills to swallow over the course of that journey, some twists that feel more like left hooks, but I felt sticking with it was completely worth it since the story, as one complete package, was extremely endearing, wholesome, and thematically poignant. Overall, I thought it was a pretty good show. If you're already a huge fan of Scott Pilgrim, if you're indifferent to Scott Pilgrim or thinking about jumping in for the first time, this is not the place to start, at least not if you're looking to be won over. The thing about Scott Pilgrim is that it's one of those popular, unpopular franchises. It has a cult following in a very literal sense. The fan base is comparatively small, but also very passionate, and keep in mind I'm saying this as a fan, that passion can be very off-putting to people. And I think if the franchise has proven anything up to this point, it's that even when well adapted, it's never likely to reach any semblance of mainstream success. So I think it was the right call for this show to solely cater itself to the existing niche fan base, rather than trying to reach the general Netflix audience. But it does put the show in a weird spot, where it almost can't hope to live up to the, dare I say, unreasonable expectations of the passionate people it's gearing itself toward, especially given how many creative risks it takes.
Spoilers incoming.
In the trailers leading up to release, the show marketed itself to be a straightforward and familiar animated adaptation of the Scott Pilgrim graphic novels, only to, in its opening episode, completely flip the script and write out its title character for pretty much the entire middle chunk of the show. The title, as it turns out, was a really clever play on words. If you were paying attention to interviews, you might have known this was coming, but otherwise, this came as a complete shock. There have been some tired, predictable, and frankly fucking embarrassing reactions to this twist, but I'd rather not talk about that at the moment, because what I will say about those reactions right now is that they're more about what the show isn't rather than what it actually is. And I'd rather talk about what the show is. And what it is an indirect adaptation that reinforces the themes of its source material, a subversive Elseworld detective story centered around Ramona Flowers, a metatextual analysis of the franchise and the cultural reaction to it, and a direct sequel that further explores Scott and Ramona's relationship using multiversal time travel.
Did you make some of those up?
The show is trying to do a lot at once, which sets up a lot of different barriers to entry and opportunities for disappointment. Even casual fans of Scott Pilgrim are not likely to get much out of this, because you're basically required to have an intimate knowledge of the original Scott Pilgrim story in order to fully appreciate what this show is doing. But at the same time, if you are that diehard fan, you're likely to be more protective of the source material and therefore resistant to the huge diversions this adaptation constantly throws at you.
No, I fear change!
Which is doubly difficult for people who are most attached to the graphic novels, who understand many of its core themes, who might find this fresh take on Scott Pilgrim to be strangely redundant. By its very design, it's a hard series to recommend, given that as a result of its attempt to surmount and supplant the lofty expectations people had for it, it is already garnering some mixed responses. Even I honestly felt like the show was a bit of a jumbled mess the first time through. Trying to keep up with twist after twist made the pacing seem jarring and often made it difficult to see the bigger picture. However, on a repeat viewing, knowing the turns the story would take, I actually thought it flowed rather smoothly and felt cohesive. Plus, it became much clearer that a lot of thought went into each of the creative approaches explored here, yielding some powerful results. First off, as an indirect adaptation, I think this series still broadly resembles and reifies the emotional experience that Scott Pilgrim has always provided. As I mentioned before, it very effectively retreads familiar territory when it comes to the original story's timely themes and character arcs, albeit through a new pair of shoes, or rollerblades, I guess. Which brings me to my second point, how it functions as an Elseworld story. This gives those incredibly familiar with the source material, specifically the graphic novels, something new and unfamiliar, while at the same time, giving fans of the film a lot more context and nuanced characterization that wasn't fully present in that adaptation, especially when it comes to Ramona. I'm someone who is a fan of the film first, so it was really cool to get to see where each of the evil exes ended up in their journey towards self-actualization, and it was even more rewarding to see Ramona making amends with those exes, this time on her own terms. Which leads to number 3, the metatextual analysis the show provides. The story of Scott Pilgrim is no stranger to controversy, especially given some of the story choices it made that stick out like a sore thumb in a modern context.
Apparently a 23-year-old dating a high schooler is frowned upon by society.
While I would still argue, as I have in the past, that Scott Pilgrim, even in movie form, is a much more challenging, subversive, and thoughtful story than it's often given credit for, maybe even more so when viewed through a modern lens, it'd be impossible for me to argue that Ramona Flowers isn't ultimately a plot device made to serve Scott's character arc. Within the film at least. The animated series seems to directly address that by doing a reversal, making Scott a plot device, which in turn gives Ramona and nearly every other character in the story more room for exploration.
Scott, I'm glad you're alive. But I'm also glad you died. It gave me a lot of space to reflect and grow.
I also feel that taking the protagonist role away from Scott, and even placing him in the antagonist role by the end, gives the audience a much more direct, unmissable look at Scott's flaws as a character, mainly how emotionally stunted he is even after settling down with Ramona. And it's for those reasons that I think number 4, this serves as a great sequel to the Scott Pilgrim story the fans have come to know and love. Life and love are never as simple as making one sweeping change and walking into the sunset happily ever after, especially not for people stumbling through their 20s who are often oblivious to their own unhealthy behavior and the trauma that often informs that behavior. It takes a lot of time to unpack those things and make amends with them, so it only makes sense to me that Scott and Ramona's relationship would be one that would require consistent self-reevaluation, acknowledging and addressing the things that keep them from becoming the people they want to be, both for each other and perhaps more importantly, for themselves, which is a much more mature and contemplative note to end on rather than the reductive idea that another person alone can fix you. So I'm willing to admit that at the end of the day, I might have just been the exact type of fan this series was made for. I enjoyed it so much, and I think that if you are a longtime fan who's willing to give something new a fair chance, you'll probably enjoy it too. It's extremely charming, nourishing, and every bit as challenging, subversive, and thoughtful as the story that inspired it, leaving me with a well-adjusted perspective on its characters and themes. And all in all, I'm just happy that I, having grown up with Scott Pilgrim, lived to see Scott Pilgrim grow up with me.